Okay, now we're going to move to, without further ado, to our final panel, which is going to look at future strategies, considering everything that we've discussed to better address the diabetes, obesity, and NCD epidemic. So could I welcome our panelists to the stage, and John, who is going to moderate, and then we're going to finish with brief concluding remarks. So over to the panel and John.
Hi, everybody. Before I welcome some of the people on the panel that we don't know, I just want to highlight that I'm not the head of global underwriting claims and R&D at Swiss Re. I'm the global CMO in the Life and Health division. That's a little bit of a mistype there. So you've met and seen a lot of our panelists in the last couple of days, but there are a couple of new faces. So I'm just going to ask Francesco to introduce himself briefly.
Good morning, Francesco Branca, the Director of the Department of Nutrition and Food Safety at the World Health Organization, close by Geneva.
Thank you. Greg?
Greg Garrett, Executive Director at the Access to Nutrition Initiative. I'm also based around the corner in Geneva.
And thank you both for making it today. It's a pity you could only manage today, Francesco. It's been an amazing 3 days, but hopefully we have a really good discussion. I noted Geordie, and there's certainly not a criticism, Geordie, at all, but we see a lot of slides like that in various ways related to health and public health, where you had, I think on your final slide, healthy diet and healthy nutrition. It's a given, and it's often a given that we all agree on what that is, right? And what we clearly have noted is we don't all agree on exactly what that is, and we've learned a whole lot in the last couple of days. So one of the things that David Ludwig mentioned yesterday in terms of how are we going to get the industry to change and move on is he was saying we've got to get the science right. We've got to get the science right, and once we do that, then it can hopefully affect guidelines and policies out there. And so I'm going to open the question to the panel and ask each of you very briefly, how do you think we can get the science right? Or maybe an alternative to that is, do you think the science is right? Do you think we have enough science? So I'll start on the far side, David.
Okay, well, maybe just very briefly, let's consider 4 designs. Animal research, which can give meticulous control over conditions, but of course the translation from a rodent, which is a nocturnal grazer, to a human is very uncertain. Epidemiology gets a bad name, but there are some questions that can only be addressed through observational research. We want it to be high quality with adequate control for confounders, long-term, mechanistically oriented, and we have to understand its limitations. Behavioral trials, clinical trials, are going to be key. They suffer from lack of intensity. So we need to really get people to separate their diets in order to ask a physiological question. If you did a drug study and nobody took the drug, you certainly wouldn't blame the lack of efficacy on the drug. You'd say the study failed. Somehow we make this a logical leap in nutrition all the time. And so we have to separate efficacy, the actual effect of a drug, from implementation, how a study is able to get people to behave differently. And lastly are the feeding trials, where you lock people up and you try to treat them in some sense like a laboratory rodent. These are very expensive, they're complicated, it's hard to get people to do this for a long time, but we know that it takes, and you've heard this multiple times at this conference, it takes several weeks at least to adapt to a low-carb diet. And so these short-term 2-week feeding studies, I think, are grossly misleading. They look at transient adaptive phenomenon. If somebody's adapted to a high-carb diet and put onto a low-carb diet, yeah, they'll look metabolically like a mess for a few weeks as their ketones ramp up, as their transporters adjust. But this doesn't tell us anything about chronic effects. And I think we need to do fewer of these short-term macronutrient studies and figure out better designs, such as in institutions, even prisons, but it could be educational institutions, prisons with adequate ethical protection, so that we can separate people in diet under controlled conditions and actually get actionable data.
Thank you. Shebani.
I'm going to speak in regards to mental health
Good.
and the, obviously the interaction of metabolism and mental health that we've been discussing earlier this week. And we have observational data. We have case series. We have case reports. We have a retrospective study. We have now pilots. So what we need next is randomized controlled trials. And we do need the science to be correct. We do need mechanistic studies as well. Within psychiatry, we have had randomized controlled trials of the Mediterranean diet looking at depression. We have pilots with ketogenic diets, but we need, again, the randomized controlled trials. And they're currently being planned. And to look at proteomic data or metabolomic data is where we're going next, as well as functional imaging, looking at functional connectivity, as well, and the brain network stabilization. I would agree as well that we can't just have these trials be 2 weeks or 3 weeks. There's a keto adaptation phase, at least with, obviously ketogenic metabolic therapies, and we need to have a longer period for the studies itself. We do have pretty good data from neurology and the field of epilepsy for ketogenic therapies, and we know to some extent, we know what's happening in the brain, but we need more data with serious mental illness.
Thanks, Greg. And you are here very much in your capacity in terms of how business, right, interacts with nutrition and how to get big food to potentially make food healthier. What do you think we need to do?
It's a very easy task. We've got it. Yeah, we're really working with business, and sometimes, unfortunately, we have to work against them as well because we're not seeing the change that's fast enough to get to, say, 2030 SDG goals. But I think the science is becoming increasingly clear around ultra-processed foods, and I think it's our job as a not-for-profit to help translate that. But there's two economic research questions that we're trying to answer. So I'd like to dive into the markets. The first one is, what is the double materiality of nutrition? What's the business case for investing in nutrition for these companies? We need to answer that if we're going to have the shareholders of these large food and beverage manufacturers start to invest responsibly for the future. And so what we're doing is we're looking at 10 years of data on the world's largest food and beverage manufacturers to see, okay, which ones of these companies have made some progress in improving their product portfolios, if any, and many have not. The vast majority have not. But those who have, what has it done to their profits and their revenue? Is there any kind of business case over the medium to long term that can be made? So the double materiality would be firstly internal, what does it mean for their business? But then external, what are the costs to society? That leads to the second research question that we're trying to answer, and that is, what is the actual cost of, say, ultra-processed foods, carbs in particular, to ill health and to society? It's been costed at the global level to be per annum $11 trillion. But at national level, we don't have the data. We also would like to be part of a movement of true cost accounting so that the negative externalities of these foods are properly costed, modeled into the foods so that we can start to see appropriate subsidies going to the good foods, appropriate taxes going to some of the bad foods. And over time, we have an adjustment on the market so that when people walk into a food retail environment, they have options which are affordable and whole and good, and some of the ultra-processed foods would be a little bit less accessible. So it's a market shift that we need, and those two research questions are really important for us, and we're trying to answer those over the coming years.
Thanks, Greg. Francesco.
So in terms of the science of what healthy diet is, we've heard many times there's no agreement, there's confusion. WHO has been working in a multi-year process to really make sure that we are using the right methodology. And we are looking at all the science, and we have a good solid method to bring together and analyze the quality of the science. We only give recommendation based on systematic reviews. We work, of course, randomized controlled trials as a gold standard, but also good quality observational studies are important. We work with the Cochrane collaboration and the Campbell collaboration to do that. And the research should be graded. There should be transparency about the questions we want to address. We also have to have independent research, and all our experts are independent experts, very, very carefully selected. I think with that we come to a very clear understanding, but also understanding of the gaps. But there's another component. I mean, it's also the element about how we implement those guidelines on healthy diet. How can we ensure that there are sound, proven solutions to obesity? And that's a much more complex thing to do. We are also developing now guidelines on policies. We have been analyzing the cost effectiveness of policies. We do what we call the best buys for the prevention and the management of non-communicable diseases. But that's where I think the research gaps are. I mean, a lot of the operational research, a lot of the context research, how we translate those guidelines in the different contexts. How do we connect, for example, in terms of food system transformation, the transformation of the supply and the orientation of demand. That in terms of how we change the food environment. I think we've done a lot of progress, but there are gaps there on how we make the healthy diet affordable, for example. And then there's the other element about the management of disease. We want to have a much more solid operational research on how services can be delivered. And services for obesity and diabetes are not sufficient. And there's no demand also for those services. We need to address those fundamental questions.
Thanks, Francesco. Gary.
Okay, so as a journalist on the panel, when I first got involved with this subject going on a quarter of a century ago, and I did a 1-year-long investigation for the journal Science on the question of the link between dietary fat and heart disease, the conclusion was that we can be pretty confident that consuming saturated fat as opposed to carbohydrates will raise LDL cholesterol. But we have very limited evidence that raising LDL cholesterol in the context of a dietary change has any long-term benefit on life itself. And this investigation I did was published under the title The Soft Science of Dietary Fat. It won National Journalism Awards. This past summer, the World Health Organization published a review on dietary fat for both health and a separate study for weight loss diets, and concluded pretty much the same thing that I did, that there's significant evidence that LDL cholesterol, that saturated fat raises LDL cholesterol when you swap it out for the carbohydrates in the diet or monounsaturated fats. But there's very limited evidence for any long-term benefit or harm. And in between those two, the most expensive clinical trial of diet in history was ever done, which was the World Women's Health Initiative dietary trial. It probably cost from $500 million to $1 billion, depending on whose estimate you use. And the result was that dietary counseling to limit the amount of fat in the diet and to eat fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes was of no benefit to women of any, whether body weight, heart disease, cancer, any chronic disease endpoint. Clearly, we have to solve that problem. That 25 years after I started, there's been no dietary counseling or protocol or institutional advice that has been more dominant and influential than this idea that we should eat a low-fat or modified fat diet for our health. There's been very little advice on the quality of the carbohydrates consumed, on the quality, the amount or quality of the sugar consumed. There have been probably several $1 billion worth of studies looking at this dietary fat hypothesis. There have been virtually no long-term studies, or none that I'm aware of, that have, except perhaps Diogenes, that's asked the question about carbohydrate content and sugar content. And in the context of this, we have a room full of people who have come to believe in the efficacy of very low carbohydrate, high fat diets, ketogenic diets for health. And we have maybe 200 studies, clinical trials that have been done that have looked at the efficacy of low carb, high fat, ketogenic diets for a whole range of disease entities. And almost universally over the course of from months to perhaps 2 years, they appear to be beneficial. So we have this gap between what the epidemiology shows, that we should all eat plant-based diets, that's the, and relatively low-fat diets, versus the short-term efficacy of low-carb, high-fat diets. That can only be resolved with rigorous science. I think we have to get away from the use of observational studies that give us associations only. They never give us causality, as Melissa was so kind to point out in her talk on artificial sweeteners. We have to do long-term clinical trials of low-carb, high-fat diets for disease states. We have to do them long enough to, if it's true, to convince the community, including people like the World Health Organization, that they should be focusing on the carbohydrate content of the diet, not the fat content of the diet. As long as we have low-quality evidence for changing dietary fat for health, we cannot give public health guidelines. The public health guidelines we've given associate with epidemics of obesity and diabetes. That doesn't say anything about causality, but it does suggest that the advice has, at the very best, done no good.
Francesco, would you like to respond?
Yes, I'd like to respond to that. So first of all, I think we need to consider the world and not only the data that come from one part of the world.
We are considering the world.
Well, I think the issue about high-fat diet is that in many places, high-fat diets are actually associated with diets with not high quality fat. So the higher amount of fat is usually associated with a higher amount of saturated fat. I think that's the point. Your point about carbohydrates, I do agree. In fact, we did wait to release the fat guidelines until we've done the work on the carbohydrates. And I think we've completely underestimated the issue of refined carbohydrates. That, in fact, is perhaps the bits in the global burden of disease that is missing. And saying that if we have a balanced diet where carbohydrates are 40 to 70% of the energy, actually the majority should come from complex carbohydrates. That's an important message that we're missing. And I totally agree with you that somehow the focus on saturated fat and total fat in the United States in the 60s has led to somehow a generation of products that were high in refined carbohydrates. So, I have had this discussion before with Chris Marin. We say, you guys are responsible for the epidemic of obesity. But, that was because I think, the response had not been a comprehensive response to, what is a healthy diet? And a healthy diet is adequacy of nutrients. A healthy diet is balance of nutrients. A healthy diet is diversity and moderation of certain items. If we don't consider all of them together, I think we're going to get wrong. So I don't think we can have a debate only on an element of the diet. It has to be an element of the whole balance of the diet. That's what the complexity is. But I do think that the quality of also observational studies now allow us to make know, reasonable recommendation about what should be a healthy diet.
I know David wants it. You can go just now. I really want to highlight that, Francesco, and I really appreciate you saying that, right? That we're missing the piece on refined carbohydrate, and I think that's fantastic, right? That the WHO is very much realizing that is a really, really important part. So thank you. Gary?
One subtext of this meeting, and again, by only coming today, you've missed it, but one subtext is the question of whether or not a healthy diet for people who are metabolically healthy, which includes balance of macronutrients, which includes moderation, is a healthy diet for people who are not. And so because such a large proportion of the population is no longer healthy, for instance, and a good example would be a diet, somebody with type 2 diabetes. Do you want them eating a balanced diet with a significant amount of carbohydrates, or do you want them avoiding the one macronutrient that they can't metabolize without pharmaceutical help? And we've had a message there for 50 years that could also be wrong. But that's what I would say also needs to be studied.
David?
Yes, I'd like to respond to Dr. Branca's argument that Two things. We have to consider the developing nations with regard to our recommendations, and also the quality of dietary fats on a high-fat diet. So actually, together with Walter Willett, Alice Lichtenstein, Frank Hu, I have a paper in AJCN just online that takes respectful issue with the qualified recommendation to reduce dietary fat to 30% or less, which just came out from the WHO. And our argument is, first of all, regarding the developing nations, people are in precarious nutritional balance with an overwhelming dominance of low-quality carbohydrates presently, and that this recommendation could actually make matters worse by encouraging what you would like to be fruits, vegetables, and legumes, but what will in practice be more starches and sugars because they're cheaper. That's true for the developing nations, and it's unfortunately also the trade-off that we've seen in the United States and Europe because the food industry makes profits on those foods. So conversely, yes, high-fat diets can be high in saturated fat, and I'm not making an argument that saturated fat is always benign. I think the combination of saturated fat on a high-carb diet is a problem. The carbs block fat oxidation, saturated fat is inflammatory. But on a low-carb diet, it's really unclear that saturated fat is a problem at all. Many high saturated fat foods, as Aaron has pointed out and others, look perfectly fine in clinical trials in epi. And so the risk actually right now in a population that's highly insulin resistant worldwide due to obesity, the problem of putting in more processed carbs into an insulin resistant population, I think, or we argue, is actually the main problem.
Francesco, do you want to?
Yeah. So I've read that paper. Thank you very much for that. I think we should have a more detailed dialogue on that. I do think that in population in low-income countries where you see the higher proportion of fat, the quality of fat consumed is extremely poor. I mean, we're talking about certain poor neighborhoods in Pakistan where they still have a large consumption of industrial trans fat, for example. So I don't think we have a good example of high intake of fat in a population which is associated to a healthy diet. So I think it's a theoretical principle. We're actually saying that 30% is the recommendation, but we're accepting that depending on the context, there could be a flexibility. There could be a flexibility also up to 40%. I think that's a big change in the way we are describing. That's why I'm saying it has to be a diet overall. And of course, we also acknowledge that diets very high in carbohydrates could be diets very poor in diversity, with very low nutritional value, with little macronutrients. So I think if we consider a single element and we extrapolate and we fight on that element, I think in any case we're going to make a mistake on a side or another. So what we're saying is look at the whole set of principles. I mean, as a guiding general principles, should be more or less the proportion. But then we need to be looking at food-based dietary guidelines. We need to be looking at the way that dietary guidelines is translated into practice, is actually translated into food. And in fact, we're saying this is the first step, but the next step has to be about food groups. It has to be. I mean, definitely the issue of highly processed, or we don't say ultra-processed food because it's associated to a classification. We say highly processed food, but meaning, that is the kind of element that we need to consider. So I think dietary guidance should be seen in that, comprehensive way.
So it's really interesting. I think the WHO has a challenge, right? Because you've got to think about the world, you've got to think about all communities, and it's maybe easy for people in developing countries to go, just eat real whole food, right?
But it is true that it's about healthy people. So we are not, when we do our systematic reviews, we always say it has to be based on individuals who are healthy. Then,
of which there are fewer and fewer today, right? Yeah. Unfortunately. So, Greg, how do the investors measure food companies, and you said whether they improve, right, their food offerings? How do they assess the improvement of the food offerings, what do they measure that against if the evidence of that is being so debated?
Yeah, this is a journey we're on, and certainly working with or learning from WHO and others on nutrient profiling. What we've been doing at Access to Nutrition is actually giving data on product portfolios from the big companies. And we're looking at the products at the micro and macronutrients and coming up with a composite score so that we can help investors understand, if you're looking at a food and beverage manufacturer in the US and Europe and then Japan, how do you compare which ones are doing better in terms of overall healthiness? And certainly there's no model. I mean, there's well over 90, I think, possibly over 100 nutrient profile models. We're using one called the Health Star Rating System, not because we think it's the best, but we think it's one of the better ones. But I think this dialogue we're having here today, a couple of takeaways for us as we go back to generate that data for investors is to see how we can include a notion of highly processed foods in that. And also, we might need to be a little bit more stringent on refined carbs and maybe knock down the scores for companies if their portfolios are heavily invested in that. Because what some of the investors we're working with, we work with 80, and these are some of the largest shareholders, and I hope some are in the room because I feel like that could be a missing element to this discussion. The 80 we work with who have signed up to an expectations document on how to invest in nutritious food companies, they manage a fifth of the world's assets, $20 trillion. These are the ones who can actually move in the right direction if we can get them to do that. And some are more active than others. Let's face it, not all 80. It's not a homogenous group, those 80. So we need to give them data that allows them to compare apples with apples and to measure product portfolios in a science-based way that also lets them see, okay, how do we divest if needed or invest or do shareholder engagements with the boardrooms of these companies to see change.
That's very good news, right? That we have that kind of potential influence to change food companies. Absolutely. So in the context of the debates and the discussions we've had just now, who should pay for these studies? Who should pay for us to get clarity? Any views? You're not allowed to say Swiss Re, David.
Okay, how about this for an idea? We asked Coca-Cola and PepsiCo to fund a $200 million trial, randomized controlled trial, comparing sugar consumption, randomizing to sugar and sugary beverages consumers and non-sugary beverage and sugar consumers. And if the results turn out to be negative and they're equally healthy at the end of 10 years, then the National Institute of Health at the USDA can give them their money back.
But the Coca-Cola has already funded a lot of research, and then I don't think that's been a very helpful contribution to science.
Well, but they have to, the question is you can fund research that's unhelpful, or you can fund research that's done correctly through people who you can trust to interpret the evidence independent of the funding source.
To me, the research should be publicly funded, completely independent, and transparent, and high quality. I don't think that companies that have a vested interest in the result of the research may be donors. We would not consider that kind of research.
That's really interesting.
And one of the interesting aspects is that our government, at least in the United States, seems to have lost interest in doing large-scale nutrition clinical trials.
So we want to have people and groups that have a clear vested interest in health be funding these things. And so I have understood more about Swiss Re business model, and I realized that it's more life insurance long-term, not health. But the most obvious is the governments, because governments have to pay for poor health of their population in one way or another. And if they don't pay for it, they suffer loss of international competitiveness because the population's too sick to work, to be productive, to fight in the military, or what have you. So we would like to see the NIH investing more than a shoestring budgets into a myriad of poor quality clinical trials that don't tell us anything. They've invested into multiple $100 million plus low-fat diet studies and 0 low-carb diet studies of that magnitude. So why is that? Is this a blocked mindset, of people that just have to retire before a new generation comes along and will look? I don't know. But that is the fact right now. Beyond government, I think the health insurance industry would be an obvious player. There's no conflict of interest because their outcomes are aligned with health. If the population has less diabetes, needs less drugs, needs less surgery, they're going to benefit, the people will benefit, and nobody's going to consider that a conflict of interest.
It's really interesting. So in preparation for this conference, I wrote thousands of emails to public health entities, particularly around Europe, right? So a lot of European countries have got national health systems. I wrote to various people to try and get them in the room, right? And all these countries are really, really suffering under healthcare costs and the healthcare burden. And not sure there are any in the room, right?
Just one quick addendum to what I said. A common argument against this is that we already know what a healthful diet is. Fruits, vegetables, blah, blah, blah. Well, we agree on some things. Almost everybody except Coca-Cola agrees on sugar. But you can see on this panel, we differ. The WHO thinks we should have 30% or less fat. I disagree. Other people here disagree. But we don't have the definitive data to know. So, and maybe low fat is fine for some people and low carb is better for others. These are testable hypotheses. We can get the answers. Those answers will be necessary to make an argument to the industry to change. And it's a penny-wise, pound-foolish status quo. But we have to change that first, I think.
I want to add something here about the previous comment about the guidelines in WHO. Globally, we're looking at global. So with mental health, at least 1 in 5 people have a mental illness. And most people with a mental illness have metabolic issues. When we look at serious mental illness, their obesity rates are double that of the general population. Metabolic syndrome is close to 40% now of those with bipolar. So I do think that taking into account aside from diabetes, like Gary was mentioning, the population there are so many folks now with mental health issues, and we know that insulin resistance is also connected to that and gives you a higher risk of developing depression, that we do need to worry about this. We need to care about this. Folks are dying 25 years earlier because of cardiovascular disease. So taking into account the guidelines, reducing carbohydrates, we know that's helpful for this population. Just want to point that out as a global issue.
Go ahead.
Well, I acknowledge the fact that we actually haven't recognized mental health as an outcome. When we do our guidelines, we prioritize the outcome of interest. There must be outcomes also where there's data. And usually it's cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and we don't have a lot of others. So mental health is in a sense, a new item. I think the science is, going to increase and will be able to, look as an outcome and then modulate our recommendation based on those considerations. But at the moment, we don't have. But can I add also something on the research? I mean, I do agree that insurance companies may have an important role. I think, the operational research component is so important. I mean, the services. Insurance companies have an interest in having the people who they insure going to the services and behaving better. So all the operational research on the actual change of the diet and the access to services is something that we need to see, and I think it would be really important to see funded.
I'll get back to you, Greg. It's really interesting on the services. So there are a lot of services out there, kind of diabetes programs, wellness programs, and so many of particularly the diabetes programs, focus on physical activity, which is good, and compliance, of medication, but a minority of them focus on carbohydrate intake. And so I think it's also sometimes hard to go, the services are kind of all necessarily good, because I think, again, the science is a little bit behind. Greg?
Just a quick comment on the insurance companies. It's very interesting. For us, we were invited to Japan to meet with several, and they are pooling their resources, several insurance companies in Japan, along with some asset managers, because they have an aging population. They are seeing, not an acceleration of hypertension, but it's a marginal growth. And they're concerned, what's the long-term investable opportunity in Japan? And so this is happening now. And I wonder, you said you sent out thousands of emails. Let's learn from Japan. I mean, it looks like they're ahead of the curve thinking about how do we invest in it's research on how do you change the food environment. So from nutrient profiling of products all the way through to behavior change, consumer demand. So I think Japan could be an interesting option.
Yep, definitely an aging population. Shebani, I wanted to ask you one question quickly on, I think Jan mentioned it on Monday in her video, right? Of course, we want to research more and we want to get more evidence and more data, but do we need to wait, right? And so I guess my question for you is, in terms of the mental health space and the metabolic psychiatry space, if you look at the totality of evidence that you've already mentioned, do you think that we should kind of sit in our hands and do the status quo, or do you think that we should really try and accelerate a change in a focus to nutrition when it comes to psychiatric care?
Yeah, no, I don't think that we should just stay status quo, because there's an improvement from standard of care, which is why I started the metabolic psychiatry clinic. And with patients, I do support and advocate for nutritional changes or other metabolism-based interventions. I think the critical piece is education and training and access to care. That's even going to move the needle forward. Of course, the science is also, another piece that has to continue, which I'm gladly, happy to be a part of. But at the end of the day, the reimbursement and coverage of these treatment interventions are also important, and showing cost effectiveness to insurers is very critical. So I do think that in the research trials that we are doing as a community, we should also be looking at cost effectiveness and looking at our argument as to how this is actually saving money for the insurance companies, because that's the only way we're really going to be able to move the needle for access to care, in my opinion. So right now, it's off-label use. And if we think about these treatments as drug treatments, like ketogenic therapies, then we need to show that it's like a drug. So we need the trials, and then we also need the cost effectiveness.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that the public health benefit, right, or the societal benefit, when we talk about ROIs, it's often, drug savings. Like, that's it, drug savings. And then you go maybe hospitalization savings, and for us, of course, mortality. But the impact to society, right, having fewer people with mental health issues, fewer people with neurodegenerative disease is just incalculable almost.
Or fewer people going to the emergency room or going into residential, yeah.
Absolutely. So are there any questions from the audience? So you can line up and ask questions.
Murdoch, GP in England, and fantastic to have an opportunity to ask such a breadth of people this. In my general practice work, I've had a special interest in metabolic health for about 13 years, and with that, some confidence, I guess, in what will work for my patients. I've also been trying to shift the local healthcare system, unfortunately, with the framing of metabolic health now, we're now achieving that. One of the major barriers, and it's not a blockade, but a barrier to more rapid change within a larger population, is guidelines, actually, and historical guidelines that can't change because the science has to catch up. Any thoughts on how we may mitigate that issue quickly?
How to mitigate the barriers to
So
acceptance of...
so kind of, I think we've recognized the guidelines aren't...
Well, again, at the moment, the kind of research we're talking about that can demonstrate that, we have to, if you're right in the way you're treating your patients, and Shebani is right in what she's doing, unfortunately, there's the bulk of the public health community believes that there's significant harm being done by the fat content in the foods that are being asked to eat in lieu of healthy legumes and whole grains and fruits. The only way to assure them that that's not happening, assuming it's not, is to do longer-term clinical trials that can look at hard endpoints and compare populations, randomized to this mode of therapy versus what is currently standard of care, and that takes time.
So I'd like to say maybe we need to do more in terms of helping primary care physicians to be very practical about the recommendation to their patients. And in the context of obesity, for example, and type 2 diabetes, this is work which is going on. In fact, health systems do not consider obesity a priority. Most health systems don't have that. I mean, they think it's a personal choice. So primary healthcare physicians are left on their own. So I think that's the issue. So rather than waiting for new guidelines, it's actually the translation of the guidelines we have into practical advice which is needed.
But are you sure that those guidelines will actually be beneficial for people with obesity? That's the issue.
Yeah,
because
they have been
Ian
designed.
would be implying that they're not.
They've been designed to look at prevention of weight gain. Then the treatment of obesity is a different issue.
David.
Yeah, I think the history of diabetes is informative here. Low-carb diet was used historically, and then with insulin, a higher carb diet could be consumed. Now, a big argument against the use of a low-carb diet is it's never been shown definitive in big multi-center trials, which actually have never been funded, but neither has a high-carb diet. It's become the diet of default. So we have a set of dietary guidelines, which admittedly are for the public, but much of the public is at least pre-diabetic, that say, make recommendations based on incomplete evidence. Those recommendations become the motivation for practice without, and in a certain ironic sense, not doing more research, because we already have guidelines that say this and we just have to focus on implementation, getting people to follow it. We continue to lack basic knowledge as to whether these guidelines are correct or not. There's a big historical inertia that's carrying them along, and I think that needs to be rethought.
Thank you.
No, come on. Please, Nina, go ahead.
Thanks. Nina Teichels. I'm a journalist, and I've spent about 20 years specifically focusing on guidelines on fat and saturated fat. And Francesco Branca, thank you so much for being here. I mean, I'm very curious about the recent report by the WHO on saturated fat, which looked exclusively at the observational data. And when you were talking about your connection to Cochrane, I mean, if you look at Cochrane or AHRQ or the GRADE system or any of these systems for evaluating data, they place randomized controlled clinical trials as being more rigorous evidence above observational studies. And in fact, on saturated fats, there are clinical trials on some 67,000 people, which have now been reviewed in about almost, I think, 30 systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have shown that those fats have no effect on cardiovascular or total mortality and little to no effect on any kind of cardiovascular disease outcomes. So I'm very curious to know why the WHO review did not address the more rigorous clinical trial evidence.
So there are criteria for inclusion of the studies in the reviews, and usually depends on the question and depends on the criteria for inclusion. So we use only studies that look at healthier population by design, And so, and then we look at all possible studies and then grade them. It's true that randomized controlled trials are the best one, but we also have very good observational data that can be actually upgraded if the bias, for example, is taken into account, is reduced, if the basically criteria are such in terms of also quality of measurement that allow us to use that. But we're also very transparent about the kind of data we have, and there's always an annex to the guidelines. And sometimes we accept that we cannot make strong recommendation, and we have to make conditional recommendations considering the nature of the evidence.
Okay, thank you.
Let me. Can I just? We're running out of time, so can we keep our questions? No, please ask a question, but just ask it really quickly. Thank you.
Let me say thanks to Francesco. He made a very good point, which I fully agree. Prevention of weight gain is different than obesity treatment. Thank you for this, because I always say, what is obesity? I have only one question, short question to Francesco. I know that everybody is talking about randomized trials, keeping this. I'm not obsessed with randomized trials. In April, Kamraj, in BMG, published excellent meta-analysis about effect of artificial sweeteners of cardiovascular mortality in type 2 diabetes. Small step, is this possible? Little bit reconsider policy about artificial sweeteners worldwide. I'm working in emerging market. I know what's happening, so-called developing country, never understand what's developing country, but point is now, it's harmful. I can take it offline. It's just a question to you. Consider this meta-analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very quick response.
Okay.
Yes, I know about that. Our guidelines are living guidelines. We have to have a cutoff point when we consider the studies. So that study didn't get it, didn't make it. So it will be captured in the revision. So, yeah.
When?
We do revisions when we have enough evidence, probably every second year. So
next year, perhaps?
Thank you. Next question.
It's about mortality.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Debbie Smith, Swiss Re. I work with John.
Sorry, Debbie, can you step a little closer?
Sorry. We hear a lot about BMI being used as an imperfect measure of health, and I've heard a lot about great outcomes with nutritional science as it's developing. But my question is really about whether there's likely to be a shift for national screening for insulin resistance instead of using BMI as a measure of health.
David, would you like to take that?
The use of BMI, the use of alternative measures instead of BMI?
Yes, to take away the focus from the slightly discriminatory thinking about
it depends. I think it depends upon what the issues are. BMI is, we all know the limitations of it, and there are racial and ethnic implications too. And these can be addressed. BMI is a measure. It's not a perfect measure. Certainly on an individual basis, there's a lot of variability across the population. It's a useful measure because of its simplicity. Waist circumference is probably better, but I'm not in a regulatory capacity to predict how this will wind up changing.
A quick answer from me too. Yes, we acknowledge the fact that BMI is not sufficient. We use it for epidemiological purposes, but for clinical diagnosis, we need other measurements. A Lancet Commission is about to be published, a report is about to be published, which is actually recommending to have BMI and one of the circumferences, not the ratio, the circumferences, probably the waist circumference, and of course, any of the other body composition methods which tells us about adiposity. But then the other point is it's not only anthropometry, it has to be clinical measurements, because that will tell us the degree of development of the condition and the risk to develop comorbidities. Obesity is a disease per se. It's not about the comorbidities that go with it, but the diagnosis of obesity can be done with a series of measurements. And I think we need to do much better in being advising GPs on how to do that.
Thank you.
And then we can't leave the topic without saying the word insulin. Please go ahead.
Ulrike Gonder, nutritionist and freelance science writer from Germany. I have another concern as we are discussing saturated fat and the fat topics and carbohydrates. And in the shadow of this comes that now there is a movement which will tell us that only plants are good or healthy foods. And I'm a little bit afraid that the animal food bashing that's going on in the shadow of this low-fat, high-carbohydrate recommendations will make things worse. Animal foods are so nutritious and so important, especially in people who do not have the money or the money to afford a great variety of things. And as a nutritionist, I'm quite concerned, and hopefully we can open up our minds and be clear in our recommendations that it's not only a plant-based, low-fat, low-saturated fat diet that is healthy. In fact, I would make a question mark about if that's the most healthy food. So it's more or less, yes, please, let's be clear in our recommendations that it's plant and animal-based foods, or has to be.
I'm not sure if there was a question there. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
Maybe a quick reply from me, sorry. The animal source foods are definitely an important component. Our new guidelines on complementary foods are stating that basically there should be a daily portion for children below the age of 2 years. So, definitely in that period, animal source food are important. There's many animal source food. It's not just meat. There's definitely eggs, fish, dairy products, which we should consider. There are alternative sources of protein and other nutrients that are very common in diets in other countries, not in the Western cultures. For example, the insect, and we need to be concerned about sustainability. The problem with animal source food is that sometimes there is this polarization, and what WHO is saying is that there should be a moderate consumption of certain foods, particularly red meats, because we know it's associated to increased risk of cardiovascular disease and cancer, and because excess consumption is certainly having a major environmental impact.
So I will just, for the sake of some of the audience, again, I think a lot of the red meat and cardiovascular risk data is epidemiological and potentially questionable, I guess.
What he's saying is that knowing that it is associated with increased risk of heart disease and cancer is an entirely different thing than knowing that it causes or increases the risk of heart disease and cancer. And without randomized controlled trials, you cannot know the latter. So you are taking an assumption and a hypothesis, turning it into a public health guideline, and telling the world to act on your assumption.
We're not having a guidelines on that.
Okay, well, try not to.
Jane Bullen from the Nutrition Network. I chair the board of something called Eat Better South Africa, and we are a non-profit that runs community programs with women in townships in South Africa. And of course, I appreciate so much all of the points that we've made and that we've all made around the system change that we're here to create and implement, which is going to take 20 years. We understand that. We're working on the front line with people that we see dying because they are eating refined foods. Is there nothing that we can do as a community in the shorter term to set some more rigorous controls in place around excessive carbohydrate consumption, excessive refined food, particularly to the poorer communities? We don't have time to wait. I don't want to keep watching people dying on the ground in my country because we're not acting quick enough.
Just a quick comment on that, maybe. Let's distinguish the carbs from refined foods. We need the refined foods to feed the people who are nutritionally inadequate and at risk in your community and elsewhere through the world, especially if we're going to listen to recommendations to at least have plant-based alternatives. These plant-based proteins, this is a critical nutrient. They are going to be processed. Very few people are going to fill up on soybeans, but many cultures eat tofu, which is processed. So I again appeal for a distinction, a physiological mechanistic distinction. Let's use food processing, which is an ancient human technology. It dates back a 250,000, hundreds of thousands of years, cooking and grinding and such. Let's use it intelligently. We need to process oils. We need to process proteins to make them available in the third world. But let's be very cautious about the processed carbs that are nutritionally devoid and will promote metabolic disease.
Any other comments on that?
Well, I mean,
you wanted to?
Certainly from where we sit as a not-for-profit, we sympathize with that. We're always looking for impact immediately. And it is urgent because, you know, the proliferation of just say processed foods, I'm not going to say ultra or highly, just processed foods into sub-Saharan Africa, the data that Euromonitor and Nielsen and ourselves are collecting show that it ranges from 40 to 300% per annum. And the new FAO report on food security and nutrition, SOFI, says that the child overweight and obesity is growing in even peri-urban areas in 8 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think, I mean, one of the things we're trying to do now is get a compact together that is signed by some of the more progressive big food companies, and we'd like to look at some of the companies in South Africa because there's some very large ones there, like Tiger Brands, to see if we can get leadership of those companies to sign up to targets that are monitored and they have to show progress on until 2030. So that's one thing that we're trying to do to accelerate action.
Great. Thanks very much, Greg. Thanks, Jane.
Arne Astrup, the Novo Nordisk Foundation. It was just a comment about that the recommendation from the WHO is a barrier for the management of type 2 diabetes with low-carb diets. And I think it's important to have this distinction, as Francesco alluded to, that the dietary recommendations are for healthy people. I think if we really want to look at the highest authority in terms of recommendations for the management of type 2 diabetes, it's a joint statement and from the European and American Diabetes Associations. And if you look at those, they actually endorse the use of lower carb diets and low carb diets. And I think with all the studies, they're updated on a quite regular basis. And I think if we look at the studies that have come out just since they were published last time, and some of the ongoing very positive studies, I think we should expect that the next version will probably be a much stronger endorsement of the use of low-carb diet. So I think for that kind of disease, I think it's completely different. But of course, having said that, I think the Francesco, you should consider that in many populations, I think in the US population, it's close to 50% of the adult population who have either pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. And we see the same more and more around in the world, that perhaps, those who are really healthy is a minority. If you consider pre-diabetes and remarkable insulin resistance as, not healthy. So perhaps there is a need for, dietary recommendations for such a group that is so globally such a large group. I think you have the same, for example, for stage 1 hypertension. You also have management recommendations there, and it could actually be the same here. And I think there's a lot of room for diet and perhaps other interventions there.
Last question. Very quick and a very quick answer.
Just a short
Thanks,
idea.
Arne.
So if you consider the track record of nutritional guidance in the past, I mean, we could also come to the conclusion to maybe not give nutritional recommendation or guidelines from top up and leave it more to the bottom to figure it out. I mean, systems work in different ways, and it doesn't have to be so hierarchical. So being restrictive on what the bottom can try and figure it out. And I see a lot of practitioners here and a lot of work that might be also restricted by guidance. So maybe we can consider, has guidance really helped in the past and really improved our system? Or should we just not guide as long as we are not sure?
Can I say sorry something at the end of this conversation? I mean, we try to do the best in terms of getting all the science. We translate articles from all the possible languages. We try to find a methodology which is transparent and is state of the art. We try to involve the best experts of the world. We try to avoid that they are conflicted either ideologically or in terms of their money. What else do you want us to do? I mean, this is the best we can have. People disagree. People want to have their own studies used. People want to have their own methodologies used. We're not going to listen to that. I mean, this is what it is. Then, there has to be an interpretation, an understanding, and a translation into different contexts. We also try to understand not just the guideline per se based on the biology and the epidemiology, but we also try to do contextual analysis, addressing the values, the preferences of people. We try to provide guidance on how this has to be translated. I mean, this is what you have. Otherwise, it's a chaos. I'm sorry. We need to start from somewhere. Of course, everything can be improved. Of course, more studies can improve our work. Of course, we need to consider the epidemiology of the population and therefore, whether we have to, deal with a healthy population or an unhealthy population. Yes, but, please, let's start from somewhere.
So, thank you very much. We have run out of time. As the moderator, I have the last say. So, my suggestion, Francesco, possibly may not be a good one, but with all guidelines and committees that decide guidelines, and I mentioned this, I think, but in the first day and the second day, we all have biases, right? Everybody has biases. And maybe something that would be good is to include people with different biases. And I know that there are people here, like very, very clever published people like Arnie or David or others that know a lot about this, like Nina, who would very happily be on a future Gary, sorry, very, very future, on a future WHO, just to kind of, I guess, have a balance and have differences of opinion.
But we have that mechanism. We always have public consultation on these guidelines. So people have the opportunity to express their views.
Yeah. Good.
I think one way of phrasing, just for a second, in the midst of a worldwide epidemic of obesity and diabetes, what your former director, Margaret Chan, described as a slow-motion disaster, or slow-motion tragedy, I forget which, it might be time to rethink. Instead of starting on the science, the consensus of the past 40 years and how that was interpreted, at some point you say, we have a tragedy that we've been incapable of reining in. At what point do we rethink entirely, rather than more of the same?
Should we rethink entirely? So we're going to stop right there. I would like to thank the panelists very much. That was great. And Francesco, thank you for being here.